But tapped just beneath the surface of any of us, we find also that myth maker, the daydreamer in us, that is already practicing what we're going to say to the boss tomorrow, is rehearsing that. And when we know how effective that can be in really leading us forward into action, we begin to get an intimation of the possibilities of that creative aspect of ourselves, which we call imagination. One of the things I've been interested in observing in the last few years is the fact that many adults, many parents have difficulty really seeing their child directly, seeing them in play, seeing them in their natural state, in the way that they are relating to the world. And speculating about that for some time, it seemed to me that one of the reasons that was so difficult for us to see anymore and to observe in children is that we've carried a sense of responsibility for their development, which may be beyond the real task that the parents have, or teachers have, or therapists have. And as a consequence, we blind ourselves to the natural energies and the natural development of the child. And instead of supporting, therefore, those natural qualities which are growing and developing spontaneously in the child, and allowing for opportunities and environments which create the spontaneous development of the child in terms of his true nature, we frequently get concerned about doing it right for the child, creating exactly the right environment, making it perfect, providing environments which make the child happy. And so often those are notions that are in the collective and in our own lives that cause some tension in relationship to the actual observation of how the child himself wants to be and to grow and to develop. As a consequence of that question I had in my mind about why it was that it was so hard for parents to see that, I have done an experiment with adults over the last few years, and that is to ask them to remember a memory that they had that was pleasant in their childhood. And to my great amazement, after having done this now with some hundreds of parents, the memories of the natural state are very common, and they have some universal qualities to them. And it seems to me that in us all is a memory of that natural state, because the quality of those descriptions has such joy in it usually. And the elements of the joy have to do with some very simple facts. One is that the child is frequently alone, enjoying himself in relationship to exploring the world. And that has been one very strong quality for me when I think about the fact that we spend so much time being frightened of being alone in our culture. And we very often will force a child into group activities. If he's not sitting on the rug with the other children, we'll get them to sit on the rug. The quiet times, the alone times, seem to be negated for children, and consequently very often for us as adults, to really honor those times of being alone and the exploration of life alone. So when these memories come back, of a childhood time when we're alone exploring a part of the backyard or the creek or wandering down the street to see who lives around the corner. But that sense of adventure and exploration in the alone state seems to tell me something very important about one quality of the natural child. Another common memory is of being in nature. Some relationship to animals, some relationship to plants, water, the sky. And when you think of all the possibilities of thinking of a pleasant time, you might think it might be going to the ice cream store for chocolate ice cream cone. That rarely comes up. More frequently it is in some very magnificent relationship to the smells and the sounds and the qualities of nature. Generally with all senses go. Tremendous memory, the smells, the tastes, the sounds. And to me that says something very important, that aliveness belongs to us, and we remember it somewhere in ourselves. And it's a quality of childhood that carries in its spontaneous relationship to nature. And in addition to the relation to the ordinary sensate relationship to nature, there's almost a sense frequently described of being in tremendous union with nature. Getting down in the grass and looking around and seeing a grasshopper and following the grasshopper and almost becoming the grasshopper as the child wanders around. Having heard adult descriptions of that, I spent some time kind of taking the veils off my own eyes and watching children and seeing them in the same way. And if you really take time to observe them, you see them exploring life in exactly that way. A sense of learning what this planet's about, learning what their relationship is to it, with a tremendous curiosity and a tremendous focus. We're apt to think the children aren't focused very often. But when you really watch them, particularly in that first year of life, when they're beginning to crawl and explore and taste and touch, feel, there's a tremendous intensity in that, if given the opportunity to wander around and explore. Because I feel that one of the strongest natural qualities of the child is that sense of exploration. They spontaneously will want to see what this new land is that they have come into. And if that tremendous intensity, that tremendous curiosity and tremendous involvement of all the senses can be observed, I have a feeling that we have a possibility of beginning to create environments in which those qualities can continue, not only in the child and the development of the child, but also in the adult. Again, that sense of curiosity, that sense of intense focus on what is there, and the sense of exploration and knowledge through the exploration, knowledge through the direct contact. It's a very different experience to see a child go after a butterfly and really look at it, see it, try to chase it, or to pick a flower and smell it and maybe even tear it apart very little to see what it's like. That intensity against the intensity or the lack of intensity one often sees in the classroom when one is reading a biology textbook. That sense of the directness of the experience of life feels to me to be one of the prime qualities of the natural sense which a child has in relationship to being on this planet. In the development of the child from birth to adulthood and beyond adulthood, an image that I've always found useful is a sense of the journey. And very often you'll see this in children's drawings. They'll draw a series of paintings or clay pieces, or using a sand tray, which is a way for children to play out some inner images. The image of the journey is very frequent in their description of their own sense of their own life. I think of one little girl who drew a series of 3 paintings. And the first one was of a ship sailing out on a sunny day. And her story is, and I'll tell you the story, then I'll tell you the drawings. The story was, if you sail out on a sunny day and don't hit the rocks, which is the second painting, You will come to your own special island, which is the third. And for me, that's a marvelous metaphor and a deep understanding of the journey of life. Because for me, the journey is to start out on the ship, hopefully on a sunny day. But it's the journey which begins is from a land already known. And that land, it seems to me, is the unconscious sense of unity with the totality. It's first experienced as a unity with the parent, with the mother primarily. But I think it's not even distinguished by the child as the mother, because that separation hasn't even begun at that point. It's a real sense of being united at a very deep level. My sense of that is spontaneous in the child. There's a very deep quality in all of us, which one could call the essential nature. Jung calls it the self. It's the larger totality. It's the wholeness that we talk about, and we talk about holistic medicine. The wellness, which comes from the same root as wholeness. It's the sense of well-being in relationship to our totality. My own experience of that beginning, as it's described primarily by children in their own drawings and their own early senses of themselves, is that they have a sense of their wholeness, a sense of the unit that they are at birth. That's not a distinct element in terms of being different from the parent, being different from the sisters and brothers, being different from the plants, that the very early experience is one of unification. However that's experienced at that stage, if it's experienced at all at a much more unconscious level, it's a memory, it's an imprint, it's a structure in us that's there and that exists, but it's not experienced at a conscious level, I think, when we're very young. And it seems to me what this journey is about for us, the life journey, is to continually begin to search for that wholeness consciously. And we make many bypaths, and we make many mistakes, and we go on narrow paths which are only partial journeys. But underneath that, I think, is a tremendous urge in all of us to essentially return home to that sense of wholeness, but to recognize it, to have completed the journey, which brings us back to the totality. I've seen children do that in clay pieces sometimes. They'll make a big round, which is the whole, and then inside they'll have that little ball, which is themselves. And they'll kind of put it in and take it out, and put it in and take it out. And so they know they belong to something larger, and that they are something larger. But the experience of life and what their task is to remove themselves from that temporarily, and that temporarily state may be the total life, in order to explore and learn consciously what they are and what life is about. That state and the development of that state is what's usually called the ego, the development of an aspect of the self as separate from. And the task of the ego is to learn, of course, how to deal with the world in some way, which is effective, in which the child can learn how to take care of himself, survive, develop his creative gifts. That somehow is the strong task of the ego. We get confused about the ego. It doesn't mean pride. It doesn't mean egotistical, but it means the development of the strength of this individual person in the exploration of the world. And the task of that ego is to go out and search for more pieces of itself in relationship to the world, so that it can increase, it can grow, and its task is to always keep increasing this sense of being awake, the sense of being aware of the world, and adding to the knowledge of self and world. That sounds like a long and large task for a child, but what I've been describing really, for me, is a metaphor for all of life's journey and the development of that. What happens, I think, in a child is that beginning exploration starts fairly soon. There's a sense of, we've all seen that when children begin to first discover their toes, as though their toes were something distinct from self, They kind of pick them up and they look at them and they play with them and they put them in the mouth and they taste them without any sense of that being part of them. And a funny kind of separation begins of the hands, the feet, the toes. So the first exploration is almost part of self, but in that beginning separation. And then the child will begin to crawl and begin to explore the room and begin to explore later outside the house as it walks. The 1.5, 2-year-old begins to walk, and you have to take everything off the tables because they go in the mouth and they have to be explored and looked and touched and tasted. You really watch a child in that exploration. The intensity of that is enormous, and the sense of, is that me, is that not me, and the sense of separation is already at foot. At about 2, I think a whole other development comes in, and for me, that's when the father, not necessarily the literal father, but the fathering principle comes in. And that's the time when I think the strongest sense of separation from the mother and from that sense of unconscious totality begins to take place. The most common word at that age is no. It's no, and it's no, and it's no. I saw recently a little boy, just at that age, who was offered a cookie by his mother, and with great desire and anticipation went toward the cookie, holding his hand up for the cookie, saying at the same time, no, no, no. It's almost as though that's the primary practice at that time, is to say no. And if you question it, if you don't say what many people say, the terrible twos, because that no, if it's directed at you, sounds, and if you take it personally, sounds like a rejection and a willful sort of disobedience. But the practice of that no, I think, is the no to that unconscious state of unity. Very often is no to the mother. It's the first sense of I am myself and you are you. So the separation or the break, I think, comes from some kind of discernment which begins then. And I have a feeling, that's why I'm saying the fathering principle, who says, no, you can do this, yes, you can do this, some sense of duality. And the father, if he operates in the home, or if some element of the mother, because mother can often carry this side, that no quality, as it develops in the child, is also the beginning of a relationship to the world in terms of self-protection. It's the quality that turns from just the nurturant quality and says, it's dangerous to cross the street. Those are big cars out there. No, you can't cross the street without looking both ways. So another principle begins to come into the child's life at that time, not just the feeding, the nurturing, the warmth of the protection, but a sense of discernment begins to enter the child. And I think this quality begins, if it operates in the child in a normal and a healthy way, you begin to see developing in the child elements of both aspects. A quality of life which has to do with, again, the nurturance, the acceptance of life, the exploration of it without judgment, and the other side which begins to judge, which begins to say, it's this and it's not that. I am myself and you are you. So that both elements can begin to flourish at the same time. The total acceptance and at the same time some level of discernment. Those are, at a most basic level, something to do with the masculine and feminine elements in relationship to the world. But in a child's development, if you really watch them carefully, there is a spontaneous movement toward that. The child's relating to everything without discernment. They don't have a sense of this is clean and this is dirty. They're just as fascinated with dirt as they are that which is shiny, polished. That discernment also comes in with the child's no, I think, in a spontaneous way. So the elements of the child which he needs for balance in terms of his personality at a later date, if allowed and supported, are spontaneously there to grow and help him in his exploration and his ability to deal with the world strongly and capably. In the story that the little girl told in the drawings that with which she illustrated it, of starting out on your ship on a sunny day. I want to go back to that as a metaphor in terms of the second picture, which was if you don't hit a rock. And of course, that's always a potential. These natural developments in a child and the development of curiosity and excitement about life and the exploration are often truncated in some way by a life event, by a traumatic event. Sometimes it's an illness, sometimes it's difficult conditions in the culture, a situation of war. We haven't had many on this land, but of course all over the rest of the planet there have been many times of war. It may be the reaction to a situation of divorce or a serious illness in the family. Those are all large and dramatic examples of those rocks which may truncate for a period of time the natural journey the child wants to take. There are also, of course, many subtle, smaller rocks in the path of a life's journey, which a child has to deal with frequently. And these very often are misconceptions about what is best for the child, whether it's in the family situation, whether it's in the school situation, whether it's in the culture. Some perhaps narrow and rigid attitudes about the development of the child nature, sometimes in the best intention, sometimes because the nature of the child is not understood, sometimes because in earlier times children were used as workforces, for instance. But any situation which seems to be collective and seems to be accepted by the collective, but perhaps may have for many children, or particularly sensitive children, not enough growth areas for them, where it's too narrow, too rigid a path, where the journey has to go between narrow, high wall rocks, instead of being able to explore the entire ocean. These are some of the subtler rocks which make it difficult in the child's path. The question, of course, always is, what do we do about those rocks? And it's a subtle and I think serious question in terms of both psychological work with children, educational work, and parenting. First of all, I think an awareness of them is important. To see that they're there, to see that they may be in our paths, in the child's path. But I think two different kind of approaches are taken in relationship to that. One is to get all the rocks out of the way, to try to clean the ocean up of the rocks. And of course that's a noble adventure, a noble task. And I think it has to do with making the society as clear and open and loving as possible, and to make the educational system as good as can be, and also the family situation. But the problem with that is somewhere, if that's taken as the only intention, that is to make the path easy, there's some consequences of that for the child. And that is that since there still will be rocks, and there probably aren't always naturally rocks in this long journey, the child is deprived at that point of how to be heroic around the rocks. And this, to me, is terribly important. I think very often about watching puppies, because you learn a lot about the animal nature of the child by watching animals. If you have a litter of puppies, 5 or 6, and watch them about 6 weeks old, just about before they're ready to take off on their own, they fight a lot. They tumble and they bite and they growl and they bite ears and they chase each other around the room and bite the tails. We never think that that's a negative conflict between all the puppies. We laugh, we watch them. And we know that when they yip at a tail being bitten, that they're not really being hurt that badly, that it's part of their developing their muscle tone, developing the capacity to take care of themselves when they leave the mother, developing the capacity to defend themselves, and also to strengthen their whole capacity to be sharp and aware. When we see children fight in a family, we have a very different reaction very often. We have all kinds of names for it: sibling rivalry, jealousy, and so forth. And of course, those are all perfectly good descriptions. But there's a tendency very often to back off from that and not see it as a natural strengthening of ego, a natural strengthening of even physical capacities to defend oneself. I recently watched a 3-year-old boy and his 1.5-year-old sister, and he's very skillful, as older children very often are, in taking your toys and sort of pushing her down slightly so it didn't look like he really pushed and she's on the floor. And if you watching her during the day, you could see the 1.5-year-old girl develop very strong capacity. She was trying it out first of all on the dog, but suddenly you saw her doing some very subtle things to the older brother too. She was already beginning to say no. She was already beginning to get a good thrust of the hand that would push him off. And a very delicate little girl she was, but you could see the beginning in her of self-defense. And not particularly in anger. It was just a matter of, well, let's see, now how can I deal with this situation, this rock of a stronger brother? How can I deal with that? So to allow for her to have the capacity to spontaneously respond to that out of herself, as well as she can, seems to me a very important aspect of life. It was a little vignette for me of the possibilities of not overprotecting, not taking all the rocks out, but allowing the rocks to be there, but strengthening the capacity, honoring the capacity that we all have to deal with the rocks. My image of that is always, as one works with a family, if one just try to make the family, the parents, better parents, in order to make it better and easier for the child, and doesn't strengthen the capacity of the child to deal with life's problems. Of course, it's a non-ending process. You then have to fix up the school, and you have to fix up the wife, and then you have to fix up the boss, and not always to the advantage of the child. I've seen children at a moment of realization that they themselves have the strength to resolve a problem, that they can deal with the situation, that they, if they have been in a conflictual situation, find a solution. The joy in finding their own strength in doing that is enormous, and sets, I think, a seed for much later recognition that can continue throughout a lifetime of, I can do it myself, at the deepest level of that. My belief is that we all have the capacity to do that for ourselves, to resolve life's problems, and very often aren't given an opportunity to do that. By that I don't mean just letting children alone when they need help, or letting children alone in very difficult, very traumatic situations. It's a balance. If they keep crashing into the same rock, then of course we want to reach out and help them, to find them way, steer the course around the rock. That is, after all, the advantage of a mature and adult parental situation, school situation, or a culture that will say, we've taken the journey, and turn back and say, well, there is an easier way. But at the same time, never negating the exploration of the child themselves, to watch it, to guide it when it keeps making the same mistake and it doesn't have an option. We as adults can provide option, I think, as long as we really see it as option. If we don't say, take my way only. This is the best way. I've made it, and I know how to make it easier for you if you follow my way. So to allow the child the space to continue to explore whatever those difficulties may be, and let him find his own strength in the dealing with them, giving him opportunities to experience that, seems to be a very important aspect, again, of this total journey. The last picture which the little girl drew was an interesting one, because it was of an island in this vast ocean, and it had 4 very large plants on it, flowering plants. And the one, interestingly enough, that was landing on that was not the ship, but a little bluebird, which was landing on the island. And her caption for that story was, you will find your own special island. So the journey ended at this little special island in the middle of the vast ocean. Now my sense of that island, it was a nice round shape, is that she had a vision, a hint, a hunch of what the end of the journey was going to be about for her in life. And that was to find herself in her own individual way, but more than just her little personal self, but the self which is the larger totality that we all have, our essential self, which is that totality that we came into life with, but unconsciously. But to have made the long journey, return to it, essentially coming home, but finding it in our own special way. She said our own special island. I love that description of it. It's like who we are in our individuality, what shape we are, what color we are, what our gifts are, what our tasks are in life. And to find that, and to find that when we get there, it's going home. Like, oh, I know this. This is where I started. Look at that. I recognize the space. But now I have known the journey. I have gotten the strength that I can, for instance, if I go off to visit another island, know my way back again. I recognize what I am, which is, of course, the ultimate life question. And this was a 4-year-old girl, incidentally, who made these drawings. So, as I have been reminded over and over and over again by children, that knowledge, that wisdom is already in the self. We know something about the nature of our work and our play and our journey in this life. And it seems to me if we can only remember that in us is that knowledge, in the child is that knowledge, and watch it with awe, really, that then there's a possibility of supporting when support is necessary and allowing freedom when freedom is necessary. Watching the process, being instructed by the process. So much of what I've learned personally in the last 20 years working with children has come from them directly. They have taught me what it is to be a natural child. They have taught me that they carry this wisdom. And as I stand in awe of that process in them, they have a chance to be confirmed at the deepest level. So I become and have become very often a companion on this journey. Older, bigger, stronger ego, but nevertheless on the same journey with them and being instructed as I can share with them my own development of wisdom now. Going back again to the little story, I'd like to look for a minute at the ways in which a child evidences having crashed against the rock. Because sometimes they're obvious, sometimes again they're subtle. One of the ways, of course, which shows itself immediately is in some kinds of conversions into the body, some illnesses. There's no doubt that there are many illnesses that are epidemic and infectious. But there are some illnesses, perhaps cancer, sometimes asthma, diabetes, some kinds of arthritis, and I don't know, perhaps even the possibility of taking in deeply even the infectious diseases, a certain weakness in the form. That makes one want to question why this child at this particular time is struck by a certain illness. Having worked now with some children with serious illness, I would really raise for all of our speculation about the relationship of these illnesses to some act of hitting a rock along in the journey. Some sensitivity in the child at some level to a crisis in the family, some sensitivity in the child to a distortion in a learning situation, some reaction in a very sensitive child. Very often it's a response to a larger political situation. I've had many children who were born actually after the dropping of the bomb, and you would see them play that out in certain aspects of their play, indicating a response to that huge life event. Knowing at some level that it had changed the whole face of the universe in relationship to our potential capacity to destroy. And many of these children who are sensitive in the body are also very sensitive at many other levels, and usually so. They're sensitive at a psychological level, and they are sensitizers of many issues in the culture and in the family that are distortions of their natural growth. And being sensitizers that way, they are very often incredible children who are our antennae to say there's something wrong. There is really something wrong. This is the rock in our path that perhaps we can collectively move. And because they are such sensitizers, I have a sense that we should pay particularly attention, not just to the cure of the symptom, not just to the cure of the physical disease, which of course is essential that they can live in proper health and vitality, but also look at what issue it is that they have chosen to take responsibility for, to tell us something about. I remember a boy who had an illness and who made a little figure called the Monster of the Weather, who had antennae sticking out of his head. And he was this kind of child. He was sensitive to the tensions in the family. He was sensitive to injustices that he saw happen in the classroom. And he carried, therefore, this absolutely incredible desire to change life. But being small and not having the capacity to handle that kind of life change, it was transmuted into the body. And it was, in a sense, for him, the final cry. Again, there's something wrong. Pay attention, there's something wrong. So my feeling about these children very often is that they are extraordinary gifts to us, who very often are, many of us, and all of us at many times, are sleepy, comfortable, take life as it is, and don't carry that sensitivity to life conditions. And these children very often are such. They are, consequently, in my own image of it, the strong ones, not the weak ones. Sensitivity is a very interesting term. We often think of sensitivity as weakness, and you shouldn't be so sensitive, we hear a lot of time. As a matter of fact, it is in our nature to be sensitive. And these children who have their senses, if you take it in that sense, there's all five senses plus what we often call the extrasensory perception. They sense far beyond their immediate environment frequently. These are natural senses that belong to us in our inheritance. And these children still have them alive. And very often they are communicating to us as almost like litmus paper, that there are some conditions, some rocks that need to be taken care of. So transmuting these sensitivities and the inability to live a natural life into the body is one form of hitting the rock. The other form, of course, is psychological. Damages to the psyche. Not damages so much as the psyche itself is hit, but responses of the psyche to the same issue. Things are not quite right. I'm not being able to live fully in the natural state. Probably if I were to describe the two ways in which this evidences itself in the most extreme form, and many variations in between, are those children who respond in terms of withdrawal. Autistic children, the most extreme case of this, in which they are withdrawing their energies from communication to the world. Usually very sensitive children, again, sometimes very bright children, who have no way to communicate out. They have withdrawn the energy in. The task is too much. Schizophrenic children, whose ego can't handle the incorporation of a tremendous life of fantasy in them, who are overwhelmed in their sensitivity to the inner life, and also very often in response to difficulties in the outer life, whose ego then is not strong enough to incorporate or integrate all of that, who are split off, in a sense, from a connection to the development of a relationship to the world. Again, very often sensitive, bright children who carry for us some sense of need for change. That's at the one extreme. Sometimes it's just a child that you may say is too quiet, stays in his room too much. Very often those are children who are just sitting there writing a poem. But if their withdrawal eventually takes them out of contact with life, then we might want to wonder what it is they're having to carry. Why do they have to keep this little secret place in them so alive that they have to shut off their total world, that they're in constant daydream and constant fantasy, and can't bring those out into life. Very often they're the ones who have made a choice somehow to keep that aspect of themselves alive, because in that place they may find a resolution to some of the difficulties they're having. At the other end of the spectrum are those children who do just the opposite. They act it all out. They are very often described as hyperactive. They're children who will be, who destroy who are violent in many ways, who also can't relate, who can't find a way to connect to peers, or throw tantrums of various kinds when they're young, are very destructive as they get older. Another way of saying something's wrong, I can't handle this, something has to be changed. The only way I know how to change it is to use my physical force, to shout, yell, kick, destroy. Something is wrong. And again, if we can keep the image of these cries, the cry of I have to retreat because I can't deal with what I'm feeling in a way that I can change the world, or I have to change the world by breaking it. We hear those as cries. Sometimes, actually, a situation that's very close to home in a family situation, or a misunderstanding that the child has about life. But very often at a much wider level, these children very often are picking up something much, much bigger in the culture that needs to be looked at, that needs to be changed. And if we could see them as gifts to us in that way and begin to try to see their message, what is it that they're responding to? What are the larger issues that they're trying to communicate to us about? They may not even know them consciously. We can't just go in and ask, hey, what is it that you have this illness for? That's where the adult mind and intuition is very important as we relate to these children, to take the time to look at them, to listen to them, to perhaps see some expression that they're giving to us, some metaphor that they're giving to us, and try to interpret that so that we can not just help them feel better, but begin to see them as initiators of change, of life change. These are two ways in which hitting the rocks become apparent in the body and in the psyche. There is a third way, which participates, I think, in both, but because of the emphasis in our culture of learning in a particular way, there are a whole group of children who have problems in the area of learning, what we call the learning disordered children, educationally handicapped children. This is another way in which hitting the rock without a capacity to deal with it displays itself. These are children who have difficulty in mastering the tools of this culture. That's again very subtle because, of course, there may be two issues. One is mastering the tools of the culture is an adaptive form, which I think we need to learn because it helps us to be part of the larger collective that we live in, as it is structured. However, among those children also are those who are gifted in expressing themselves in other ways than we have defined as learning. These are children who are often very gifted in other areas, and it's very important to discover where these gifts are for them, because they may be balancing an attitude toward learning which is too narrow. And in spite of the fact that we call them educationally handicapped, they may be, in point of fact, gifted in areas which are very related to learning and to explanation of life and to understanding of life from another form. The arts, building crafts. Very often these are children who do, in fact, balance their lack of ability to handle the ordinary ways of learning, arithmetic and reading, for instance, by very strong gifts in the other areas. And I've often wondered if just the very fact that their lack of ability in certain areas didn't give them the energy to balance not only their own learning, but to balance our whole attitude about what learning is about. So in some ways, these are like the other children who perhaps carry the sensitivity. They're carrying a task that's larger than sometimes they can handle in order to balance what life needs. That is, an expression of our understanding of life in other ways than the written form and the mathematical form, but expressions of it metaphorically, expressions of it in construction, in another kind of creation, which also explains life and understands life. So again, these children perhaps might look as though they had hit a rock, but as a matter of fact are telling us that the pathway is too narrow. Of course, it's difficult for children. It's difficult as it is for the ill child. One wants to make the body whole. It's difficult for the children who are carrying a psychological problem. We want them to be free, to be in life joyfully and in relationship. Also, it is true for these children who have learning difficulties defined by us as such. It is important in this culture because we use the written form as much as we do, that these children be helped to balance their life by the things they need to adapt in this culture, but not at the expense of gift, and not at the expense of the balance that they, I think, are trying to bring into life. So again, as we work with these children, as we are their parents, as we are their teachers and therapists in some cases, it seems to me what we have to hold in our mind constantly is helping them to balance their lives in such a way that they can belong to the system as it is, as easily as possible, but also to see what message they're trying to give us about the limitations of the system. If we have a child, for instance, whose family is not giving them enough nutrition, we would surely want to help feed him in school if he didn't have enough, but also we'd want to find out why the family wasn't able to give him enough food. It may be economic, it may be a problem in the family of rejection of the child. So we might want to enter into that system in order to help provide the child more nourishment, at the same time giving him nourishment at the moment. But if we only give him nourishment at school in the morning, and he has no nourishment the rest of the day or the week or vacations, we haven't really entered into the system which he is trying to tell us about by coming to the school hungry. Metaphorically, I think these are the levels we have to look at the lives of the children when they display that there is a rock that they have bumped into. We need to look at the symptom, the hurt that's occurred, and try to provide some relief, but also look much deeper underneath and see why it is that they have hit the rock, and honor them for being the carriers of that message to us, so that we don't forget that we have work to do yet, all of us. And in a way, that's part, again, of what I was describing earlier. It's part of a journey. It's part of our journey, and we are all on it. It's part of the way in which we keep our muscles flexed. And if we pay attention to the children and these messages that they give us opportunities to do that. How do we make conditions better? How are we creative in change in life? Paying attention to larger and larger issues, so that not only the children, but we also, in the process of working with them, come to our own special island. Of course, if one is going to talk about the rock and how it looks like when a child has hit the rock, it's very clear the next question would have to be, what is the rock? What are those rocks that the children hit? I mentioned some, which are some difficulties in the family, some difficulties in society, war, serious illness, and so forth. But I'd like to expand a little on the second description I made, which are the subtler rocks that we hit. And I think that probably one of the strongest senses of that rock that I can share is that there is such an expansive nature in all of us, and that quality that I was describing of the young child to be all senses go, all intensity, all exploration, all very clear sense of unification with the world, the stars, the animals, the plants, a sense of being more than part of, but the same as, united with, all of the tremendous expansion that is in our nature and that a child lives in. What happens is that cultures develop, family systems develop, the personality develops, which for me is claustrophobic. If I think about it, it's as though that marvelous sense of expansion suddenly narrows down to this family, this school, this culture, this idea system. And what happens to this marvelous sense of the totality? The child begins, of course, to respond to that quite early, partly by imitation. He learns particular language. There was a marvelous article that I saw in the dentist's office, where you always read quickly and short articles, about the universal sound of the child. And there has been some work in coding or recording the sound pattern of infants, almost the same work as they're doing with dolphins, to see if there isn't a universal language that comes in the sounding of a child. It seems to me absolutely extraordinary, if you think about it a moment, remember here in a moment, the quality of a child's voice, that little tiny body with a voice volume, that's huge, huge volume, a volume that we rarely use again, unless we're doing opera, rarely. And not only volume, but range, the tonal range of a child's voice. If you listen to it, and the inventiveness, the high pitch and the low pitch, it's tremendous capacity to sound. And when you think about that, and think about how even my voice sounds right now, within a narrow range, certain language pattern, it's very small in relationship to that great capacity that we come in with. And then the question is, what are the consequences of that? For me, that's one of the subtle rocks. The sense of taking for granted that this is the only capacity my voice has, forgetting all that range, all a sense of volume, all a sense of a scale that I had at birth. And this, for me, is one of the most exciting areas that we have a chance to look at now, is how can we take those rocks out of the road? How can we begin to expand back to our original capacities again, our original abilities to relate to life in the fullest sense that belongs to us by nature? There's another beautiful film that suddenly comes to mind of children at first day of life, newborns, done by Ohio State, some of the physicians there. And what they did was to look at these very small children and watch them move in relationship to their mother speaking to them. And the mother was saying something relatively simple, like, "Aren't you a pretty baby?" And she would say it over and over again. And as she did, the child would move in absolutely choreographed movements to that sound. And what they did was slow that down, slow the mother's voice down to the pattern of that sound. And the movements to the pattern of the movement, they were absolutely in similar pattern. Now that says something, and said something to me almost overwhelming in terms of its reality. As we speak ourselves out, and this new child comes in to life, imprinted by how we speak to it, in very often the narrow range that we have of speaking, their movements then eventually become also restricted. And if we could imagine ourselves sounding to the child as he sounds in full expansion of sound, just imagine what the movements could be like. Full, excited, full range, full volume, movement of the body. What extraordinary dancers we would have by nature if we would move closer and closer to our own full expression of the capacities that we have lost by this narrowing down. The adaptation to a particular form, a particular pattern, which is ours. And every culture has had a pattern. Every culture does develop one. Mostly adaptation to survival to begin with, certain ritual forms, certain kind of collective forms. And the problem that we have as adults, and the problem that we then give to our children as inheritance, is that these patterns are taken for granted as the true reality. This is what life is. And so children, being imitative, since this is the way they learn, will imitate the parent, will imitate the father, the mother, the aunts, the uncles, the teachers, and they will begin to narrow their experience into these adaptive patterns without recognizing, because we don't recognize, that they're only a narrow, narrow part of the full spectrum that is human life. Then, however, there is in us the rebellion. There's that deep urge in us, which I mentioned earlier, to experience the totality, which is more than just a memory of how it is when we came. That totality is always there. It's always there, that sense of who we are as a total being. And that larger total being, the self, will complain after a certain point. It hurts, it's too narrow, it's too small, ouch. I need to push out of it. Now, how that pushing out occurs depends very often upon the kind of child, kind of adult we are. Sometimes it occurs in painful ways, again, in the body, in the psyche, in ways I've mentioned, in problems in learning. There is another way, and there's another way that belongs to us, again, by nature, and that is to use that push out of that narrow box, the box that we have lived ourselves in and is too small and that hurts after a certain point because we can't fit into it anymore. And that is to create, to begin to create a larger environment for ourselves to live in. And I believe, I know now from the numbers of time I've been shown that in my life, in lives of friends, in lives of the children that I've known intimately, that desire of the self, the desire to heal or to make wholer than we were before, is so strong that it's almost its prime intention. That is, how can I help you, you child, you adult, you culture, you educational system, which has served its purpose for a while but is now too narrow. How can I make you grow? How can I make you change? How can I make you bigger so that you can function more for the totality? I feel that it's the energy of that self or larger being that we are is so enormous in its intent to create that for us, that if given an opportunity, it will do that in the most creative way. One of the ways that comes to children, very often into adults, is through many ways that we sort of sneak in behind us. Dreams are one way. A dream will bring an image to us that says, there's more, there's a lot more. You've missed this point. People always say, when they have a dream, spontaneously, many people will say, but I don't understand it. Of course we don't understand our dreams immediately. because our understanding is always narrower than the dream will fit into. The dream is going to break us out of our understanding. So we have to live with the dream. We have to live with the emotion of the dream, the impact of the dream. Maybe someone else can help us see the impact of it. But it takes some time, very often, for our understanding to grow, our consciousness to grow, to incorporate the event of the dream, which is bringing more of ourselves into awareness. Creative artists of all kinds, those that we call masters, have always lived at that level. They have always mastered more than the ordinary sight can see. They stretch us. They say there are experiences, there are laws, there are harmonies, there are beauties that are much more than your eye can ordinarily see. This is their mastery. They master more than we ordinarily have a chance to experience. So we are instructed by them. In us, there is always that master. In every child, there is a master. One of the most incredible drawings I've ever seen is of a 9-year-old boy, who had a big green circle encompassing this mass of growing, moving, changing color, vitality. And he entitled it in bold green letters, "The Masterpiece." A beautiful sense of self, his own drawing, and knowing that he was being instructed by the inner master. That's the energy and the force in us that really wants to remove the rocks in our path. Not from the outside, but from the inner sense of knowledge of that larger and really easier path for ourselves. You see it in, doesn't have to be, that's why I wanted to describe that masterpiece of that 9-year-old boy. That is a masterpiece. It doesn't have to be Rembrandt. It doesn't have to be Van Gogh. It doesn't have to be Mozart. They surely were, because they understood at the largest level some of these. But we have that in us, if given a chance to be expressed. And it has to be done with that kind of energy. The atmosphere of creation that we can give for children and for ourselves has to have something to do with that. It has to do with expression of self. Not just, well, I'm drawing this because I'm angry. That's one way, and it's a useful way. But this deeper sense of being instructed by what comes out of us. To sing the song that we've never heard before by our ears over radio or television or in the concert hall. But that deeper self of us already knows. So as we sing that one out, we are instructed about our own song. And those creative expressions, if allowed to come out of ourselves spontaneously, given an opportunity, will remind us of that larger being that we are. It's the first beginning kind of breathing out of the narrow constructs of the family, of schooling, of the culture, so that we begin to experience that more that the self really wants. I've seen over and over again, children particularly, because it's still so alive in them yet, that capacity to create, will resolve problems that they have, will resolve conflicts in the family by a drawing. They know what the resolution is, that deeper part, the master in them. And it's expressed usually easily, spontaneously, artistically, because that is also a natural part of the human being. The cave painters, early ones in France, the petroglyphs that one finds in the Indian caves around here, are very much related to that early spontaneous capacity to create ourselves by creating out of ourselves. When a hunter would go out to get a buffalo, he would draw the buffalo on the wall in order to understand the buffalo, to have power over the buffalo, to get to know what it was like. So that when he met the buffalo, he would already have knowledge of the buffalo. He was expanding, he was teaching himself about the buffalo by his own action as he drew it on the wall. In the very similar way, children will, if given an opportunity to do this spontaneously, gain power over themselves by creating themselves on a piece of paper, with a piece of clay, in a sandbox, by building something in sand on the beach, by telling a story, by play acting, theater, by imagining that they are a dragon and being a dragon, going around roaring. Some dragon aspect of themselves is known, and they are given the ego, the small ego as it develops, is given the opportunity to have control over that. And not only control in the sense that, let's get rid of that dragon, let's learn how to control it, but they begin to have an intimation that they are also part dragon. And that's where the excitement comes. That's where the excitement is that says, yes, I'm 5, I live with the Smith family, I live in North Hollywood, and I go to school in the neighborhood, and I belong to the Boy Scouts, and I pledge allegiance to the flag. All of that, I know that, but I also know that I'm a dragon. And that's the beginning of that sense of the larger self. The little girl who drew those drawings chose to reach her special island as a bird. Very interesting. She came on a ship, she got somehow past the rock, and then she landed on that island as a bird. Because somewhere in her she knew she also had the qualities of the bird. So she wasn't just the little 4-year-old girl walking along getting to the island, but she already knew about it. But in that series of drawings, she experienced that larger aspect of herself, absolutely necessary to the end of the journey where she knew all of who she was. Those forms, the forms of play acting, those forms of the creative arts, the forms of painting, music, sound, song, storytelling, myth-telling, legend, all the acts of the old troubadours, the wise men, the Indian grandmothers sitting around the fire at night, spontaneous, natural ways of keeping alive these larger aspects of ourselves. And we're just beginning to remember that that's so, just beginning. The storytelling form is beginning to re-enter our culture. We're beginning to pay attention to the old myths, to the fairy tales, the legends. We're beginning to consider that the expression of ourselves through sound and through paint, through form and color, is not just a leisure time activity, something to be done if there's money for it in the schools, but an absolutely essential part of human nature, as essential as breathing, as essential as eating, as essential as dreaming at night. All of these actions of ourselves, which allow the master, the deeper part of ourselves, to instruct us about ourselves, to begin to allow for the wisdom that can come through our own action in creating. For my belief is that as we create in that form, we are actually in the process of creating life, our lives, and consequently the life of the collective in which we live. Of course, one can't really use the metaphor of a journey and exploration and intensity and excitement in this time without talking about our involvement with space exploration. And that's not even a metaphor now. We have gotten to space. And Joseph Campbell, who probably is the greatest defender and articulator of myths in our time, has talked a lot about the making of myth. since he feels that is, again, a natural capacity of man, which is always in operation. And to be instructed by the old myths, to know our history, and to know the universality of that, but also to ask, what is the myth of this time? And I happened to hear him several weeks after the moon landing. And I've never seen a man who was probably in his late 60s at the time in such a state of ecstasy. He kept saying, we've got it, we've got it, we've got it. It's the new myth. Something about the landing on the moon. We talked a lot about the landing on the moon as being the beginning of the reconnection with the feminine, the receptive, the quality of reflection back, and that men who had now used all their technical knowledge and their sense of heroism and adventure had been the first to put their foot on that feminine orb. You could feel his excitement about the sense of the new myth, the new hero story, the new sense of journey. He even told a story, which I love, about a Russian woman who was an astronaut and who had wanted to be on that first moon landing and wasn't, since we got there first. And she was asked a question by a reporter, what would you have done if you had landed on the moon first? And she said, oh, I would have brought a dozen roses. And he was, again, so thrilled with that response, as though she knew, the feminine knew, the incredible sense of coming together of that event, a real possibility of acknowledgement of the feminine. So we are involved in the journey. We are involved in the expansion of our sense of the world, of the universe. And I think of a tape that I've heard of Russell Schweikart, who was an astronaut, who also said it very well, also in a state of tremendous excitement as he was being interviewed about his time in space. And he said something very important, first of all, that as he's looking down over the planet and sees it as a totality, as the total, as the whole venture, he wants to take a friend in either hand and say, look at that. From where I'm looking, there are no boundaries. There are no boundaries. What are we fighting over? There are no boundaries. And then he says a very interesting thing, is that for the moment of time that the camera was malfunctioning, I was able to see. And that phrase keeps coming to me frequently, because what it says to me is the minute we stop working, and that was his work, in a particular way, limiting our focus to what we can see in the camera, of our vision, of our culture, for that moment we can rest into seeing the totality. And I believe that one of the things that is helping us all, and our children will, and are already profoundly affected by it, is the sense of the communication around the globe. Travel surely has done it for many of us already. When we get into a culture, as I was in India 6 years ago, which is 180 degrees different from our culture, one begins to see how limited one's view of many things are. The family structure, for instance, is very different in India and Nepal, in the villages. One goes down into South America, sees a very different aspect of culture, a different way of treating children. Japan, China. Each one of those instructs us about another aspect of the human possibility. It isn't that we have to adapt them immediately, but we know that that we are then living in a limited way if this other possibility is there. And that possibility also, I think, is beginning to instruct our children deeply. As the East is coming to the West, and the West is coming to the East, and we are beginning to travel, experience, know the forms of other culture, not only in space, not only geographically, but also in time. As we see on television stories of older times, primitive tribes, cultures, rituals that belong to other times, we begin also to remember some of those rituals that we have forgotten in this time, and also begin to expand our sense of the way in which we can deal with the world. So that in addition to the outer expression that comes from the inside, which I would call a creative act in general, in whatever form that creative act is expressed, it seems to be there's another large possibility for expanding our sense of the totality, and that is in space. That is to move around the globe and go backwards in time and forwards in time. The forwards in time, as I say that, is I think where you find the child mind most active. That is the forwards in time. That's where the imagination comes into play. If you watch them play mother, if you watch them play fireman, if you watch them play astronaut, if you watch them play mountain climber, you see them leading themselves forward in time with their imagination. They are masters of that. They spend a great deal of their time doing that. They almost foreshorten time. They may be 5 or 6, and you see them climbing a little hill as though they were mountain climbing, and you know they're already mountain climbers. That experience of the imagination already takes them into the physical experience that they may have when they're 30. They may never have it in actuality, but they already had it in that moment of time. They know what it's like to climb a mountain because their imagination vividly has taken them into that. So to allow the imagination its space, to turn off the camera for a moment, the work, the narrowness of focus, and allow that imagination to see future possibilities. A child does anyway naturally. And if space can be made for the child to continue to do that, the child in us as well, to continue to do that and be honored, we no longer, it's been maybe 10, 15 years since I've heard someone say, it's only your imagination. We really have come beyond that. And I think the drug culture has helped tremendously in that. We don't say it's just a dream. So we're beginning to honor the dream, the vision, and the products of the imagination, the images, which are the results of the functioning of the imagination. It's tap underneath the surface of a child. That's what they're doing. They are imagining the future. And they are playing it. They are playing it as an actor plays a role. You see a child change roles quickly, often. Plays a role he doesn't like it, he tries another one. He says, oh, you play that part, I'll play this one. You be the teacher, I don't want to be the teacher. You be the mother, no, I want to be the father. They switch roles quickly because they understand that. They're trying them out for size. They're giving themselves lots of options. They don't want to be, as the deeper part of us doesn't want to be stuck with Mary Smith, psychologist, working at so-and-so clinic in Los Angeles only. And you see the results of that change already. Many young people are already living that. They work a certain piece of work for a while, learn, and they go on to something else, they explore something else. Much more mobility. So I think we are already moving toward much more fluidity in that. But the origin of that and the deep thrust of change that is in the possibility of the imagination is already alive and well in the child. And given space to be articulated, to be explored, to be enjoyed, really the sense of imagining the future in all of its possibilities. We then have the energy that is behind that system of the imagination, which is enormous, enormous. It doesn't just come out in the works that we call the arts. Every invention, from the earliest primitive tool, has been created after an image. Every one. The computer is nothing more than an image of the human mind. So that we have the image, which we then can lead us forward to create something. As we image to create something out side of us in an actual manifest form. We also can image what our lives are going to be like. Not only in terms of work, but in terms of relationship, in terms of community, in terms of what the whole totality is, our exploration into space, into universe. Those are all also in the imagination. Science fiction is filled with it. Old myths are filled with it. But tap just beneath the surface of any of us, we find also that myth maker, the daydreamer in us, that is already practicing what we're going to say to the boss tomorrow, is rehearsing that. And when we know how effective that can be in really leading us forward into action, we begin to get an intimation of the possibilities of that creative aspect of ourselves, which we call imagination. The power of the image to create something for us in the future, in the next step. And I think we are finally beginning to remember how powerful that is. It comes to mind a statement of the Bushmen. Life is a dream, dreaming us. That's a deep understanding of that. And when we begin to participate in that dream as active members of the dream, and begin to know that that dream can shape and shift and change, and that our creative imagination can have an impact on our lives, then I think we will begin to really know what that journey is about, that we start from one island to another island. And take the course and the pattern that we would really like to take. For I feel that's the ultimate life task, and that children know about, that is to take the journey that belongs to them as individuals, to take it well, to take it courageously, and to take it with strength, and to create it in front of themselves. Where do I really want to go out of myself, my own individual little being, the way I'm structured, the way I'm made, who I am, where I came from? How do I want to get from here to there? And how can I create that in front of me? And as long as the imagination is honored and given support, I think we will keep alive that capacity to take the individual journey as it is meant to be taken by each human being. Looking at this stone reminds me of an image that you see almost universally, and children make it very spontaneously, as early as they can scribble almost, which is the circle. A circle which encloses another circle. And for me, it's a marvelous metaphor for the whole process of life. And I believe that's why children make it so spontaneously, from some deep intuitive understanding of that. Because for me, one aspect of it symbolizes the emergence of the self from the totality, which is the child, and the struggle of life, which they have to become the individual, to emerge from the totality, the involvement with the mother, the identification with the mother, to become themselves, the individual, and how that emerges, and how the struggle of life is to find out who we are without eventually ever losing the contact with the totality. And there is a deep sense of that within the child, and I think within all of us, that we belong to this larger whole, but at the same time have to hold on to this individual space, which we can really move out from and observe the totality and move back into as we learn to understand this connection, so that eventually we can become the totality which we are with the universe. And I love that it comes in nature this way too, because I think it is a natural understanding of the process of life. And the very fact that children do this, almost the first thing that they do is to draw this circle within a circle. And it's that deep intuitive knowledge, I think, that a child has, that he becomes more and more conscious of as he begins to involve himself in the process of becoming an individual within the totality of himself and the collective. I couldn't resist that one.